part about the mosquito when he's like,
Oh, yeah.
think about how cultural that is.
Mm-hmm.
And to the other person, it was like,
what?
These people are like, you know, they don't know, they don't understand, but it's like, think about
the way it portrayed the mosquito. Yeah.
Well, even the act of using bug spray.
Yeah.
Like, that's not a part of their, it's like bugs are a part of life, you deal with it, so we don't have these like, oh, bugs feeling,
right.
Like, there's no language for that in the culture.
Yeah.
And that was mostly what I wrote about, is like the connection between this article and Vygotsky, because everything is so grounded in the social and cultural like context that things that don't exist you don't have words for. And so if you have this attitude of everything happens in the moment, we appreciate like the present, we don't think about the future or the past, like you don't have words for it. It's not a primitive like language, it's a worldview, and it's a language that reflects that worldview. And so when all these linguists are coming in, they're like, oh, it's just a very primitive form of language, but it's like, no, it's a different worldview.
Well, it's not, if you think about it, you know, they hum, they sing their language, we do those things, but that's, to us, that's like separate things to do with the language. To them, that's normal speech, like normal everyday speech. They teach their children how to speak by singing to them, like, it's just so beautiful.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting how people characterize, like, resistance from colonization as primitive. Because, like, if there's anything that is, like, not primitive, it is resistance to colonization, you know? That is, like, holy crap. Like, if you can resist an entire world changing around you and maintain your culture, then...
That's such a good point, too, like, how the critiques were like, oh, by saying, like, because you're saying they're different and, like, have a different, like, experience and way of knowing than, like, Westerners and, like, the Chomsky model, you're saying they're primitive, but it's like that's not the case. Yeah.
They made the point often that like all of these things that made linguists think of them as primitive were not cognitive, like they weren't had nothing to do with their ability to think. It was all cultural, again, with their worldview. Like their worldview is different, therefore their language is different. It's not primitive, it's not a cognitive deficit, it's nothing like that. And there was, like, just to show some of their resistance, I thought it was so funny. They were talking about, like, when researchers would come in and, like, try to find things out about their language, they would make fun of them and give them bad information on purpose and, like, just tell them the wrong thing. Like, they were having fun with it. And it's just these researchers being like, oh, just this primitive native language that doesn't do anything. Yeah. I mean... If you like have the ability to make fun of these other people and just be like, we totally reject what you're trying to do, like, come on.
There's a lot of dismissal too of like their autonomy too, like the fact like they were aware like of, I mean, like these people and like what was going around them. I mean, they like it talks about how they were fine with like I think it was like they incorporated more modern clothing, but it's like they just like.
The men.
Yeah.
But the women still don't dresses.
Yeah. But they just like were, I mean, they just were making like the choice like to honor their culture.
And there were other evidence of them incorporating new things and like language change. Like they did have a word for planes, which obviously is not something that would have been like originally in their vocabulary, and like the kids would make models of the planes, but like it wasn't part of their everyday life, and those models were only ever meant to be temporary and not something to like keep playing with forever.
I just think it's so interesting how, I mean, I've never imagined a world without a past or a future. So that's really hard for me to understand.
It's interesting. It definitely was a good article for like showing how language, and this is right up Vygotsky's alley, like how language plays such a role in the way we know, like how the very act of like how their language functioned, like determined, I mean,
the cognitive
function. Their culture, and it just sounds like Chomsky doesn't do a very good job of like recognizing that. I mean,
doesn't recognize that.
Yeah, like the ability to have language maybe is universal, but he just is like, it just seems like he really thinks of like basically if your language, all language develops in the Western understanding of language,
Mm-hmm.
and that's not right.
Which I don't really understand his need for the universal grammar.
Yeah.
Like the whole premise of Chomsky was that you should be able to take any language, break it into trees, and it will all follow this universal grammar.
Yeah. Well, he just like also seems to be like, well, if that's not true, then it's too much work to figure out what is true, or like that we may not entirely know. Like that seemed like his argument for why like his theory was true. It's like he thinks the world will fall apart if universal grammar isn't true.
It also seemed. Go ahead. It also seemed like if he had this theory on universal language that he says something along the lines of, I don't know if maybe I misunderstood, but something along the lines of, well then we don't really need to look at past languages anymore. I don't know if you guys, if y'all got that
He said
at all.
like
But I
that.
sort of got that out of it.
Well, yeah, and he was kind of like, it's not. He basically would dismiss every example of like other languages.
So if they don't fit into the universal grammar, they're just primitive.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're earlier forms of a current language that does fit the universal grammar.
Yeah.
So, I forget what I was gonna say then, but one thing that I think I understood, but it confused me a little, is like this big deal about recursion.
Oh, yeah.
So it says that it's a
Oh,
linguistic operation that consists of inserting one phrase inside another of the same type phrase. So normally you see that in prepositional phrases, like where you can just make a big sentence. But I didn't and then there was this other scientist that came in to try to prove that they also had recursion, which they don't, and basically, but them proving that not all languages have recursion was a big deal, and I didn't understand why.
Yeah, I don't, and I've taken 2 language classes about grammar, and I'm okay. That sounded like I've taken 2 language classes.
I should
You know
understand
everything. You know everything. You might as
Yeah.
well be the world's greatest linguist.
God, too many people like that.
It sort of just says that it's because it's recursion, it's cognitive, not linguistic. That's pretty much what it says about it.
Well, what
Wait, wasn't the presumption that recursion because it before and after, it was a different before and after, like before the I don't know. Before they found that they don't have recursion, it was they thought recursion was linguistic, no? And then after they were like, oh, it's really cognitive, or other way around.
I think that's what Everett
They
Everett
they
found that it
used
was.
it to distinguish human language from the language of animals. Because animals make sounds and they communicate with each other, but the one thing that human language does that animals don't do is use recursion.
So recursion is just the ability to link. Because I
Because
know
instead of
thoughts
having it in discrete units, it's all flowy, I guess.
Yeah.
And they didn't do it because culturally they view it all as in the present, right? And
But they couldn't say that it was primitive because they were hella smart people.
Yeah, this article's overwhelmingly interesting.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
yeah, it is interesting.
I mean, it is 30, 40 years of study in one article.
I know. And, yeah, I mean it was a long one.
Even he was that's crazy. I mean that's insane too. The way he himself was influenced by all of
He
this.
became an atheist.
I know. Yeah.
Like his purpose was there to basically study but also convert.
I kind of really liked
the
that
end.
when they
right?
he was reading them passages from the Bible and they were like, oh, so you know Jesus?
Yeah.
And I was like, no,
You met him?
Yeah.
They were like, so then why are you even talking about him?
Yeah, it was really, for one thing, it's nice that they didn't try and separate the researcher from what was being researched in terms of I guess it didn't really make the pretense for objectivity. It just talked a lot about his life and what his biases going inward and how his beliefs changed as a result. Yeah, it was an interesting backstory in how he became a alienated Chomskyite. Well, like he renounced his Chomskyism.
So I think this part right here summarizes pretty well. So the ability to put thoughts inside other thoughts is just the way humans are, because we're smarter than other species. Everett says that the Pirahang have this cognitive trait, but that it is absent from their syntax because of cultural constraints. So
Okay.
it's supposed to be something
Okay.
that humans can do, but it's just culturally they don't do it.
Okay. Okay.
So it's a cultural constraint.
Yeah.
Got it.
And
Yeah. So like the test that I forget who the other researcher was who went with Fitch. He was doing that test with the computers and the
Yeah.
monkey. He was trying to get them to like notice the patterns in speech
Yeah,
by
I was
guessing
kinda
where the
confused
monkey
about
would show
how
up on a
that-
screen, which sounded like a really weird convoluted test to me.
Yeah.
But I loved Everett's reaction to it because he said like the cognitive issue here is the cultural impediment to doing new things. Like he doesn't know that there is a pattern to recognize. It's not that like these people aren't like capable of recognizing a pattern. It's just like
Why would you do that?
why would there be a pattern? Why is there a monkey on a screen? What should I do with this monkey?
Yeah, I mean, and it just seems like the other researchers don't really like disassociate themselves. I mean, granted, it's a hard thing to do, but they don't disassociate themselves from their cultural assumptions going
Yeah,
in.
they
And-
think they're objective.
Yeah, and so like they just don't understand what it would be like to not like be so like involved with the system and so like integrated into it. Kind of makes me wonder like why do you all think like what does this have to do with like being like teaching English language learners
That was
and
my
just
question.
That's a good
Yeah,
question.
that was the question.
Well, I think definitely like taking your cultural assumptions out of it is like the
Yeah.
number one thing probably, and like making sure that you're not based on how a student is learning English or whatever language it is they're learning. Don't assume that if they're not at this specific point, by this specific time period with their language progression, that it's because of an inability to do so. Having to look at more factors than viewing deficit automatically.
yeah.
For me, it had more to do with content learning than necessarily like English language learning. Because if you think about like how different possible things we would do in a classroom exist in our culture, like how things are described, the different things that we do, if someone comes from a culture that doesn't have those same views, like a totally different worldview, it's gonna be like, why would we even be asked to do this? And that can turn into, well, then I'm not going to do this. Or just taking that extra time to like question, why should I do this before like just jumping into it?
I see, yeah. That's a good idea.
Yeah, and obviously there, with the nature of globalization, there is going to be like a little bit. Some students might be like familiar with some things, but it's just I think a lot of these are really big picture lessons too. Like I mean about what cultural assumptions you make, what assumptions you make about like what's supposedly universal. Because there's so much of that. Like the whole like academic disciplines are based on like universality. And yeah, I just feel like this had some really big picture themes.
What I kind of kept thinking about is like how so there's this big picture things of you have to take culture into account in your own biases, in your own ideas of like everyone should know this kind of thing. But we know that this language is not the only language that doesn't have tenses for present, for future, or past. Like I think Chinese is one of them that they just say like.
I think Chinese is one of those cases that focuses more on the future. It's something like that.
No, they focus on the present. As far as I know,
I don't know.
maybe tell us if you know. But
I don't
Yeah, I got
remember.
a
I don't
question.
remember very well.
yeah,
It's
as
something
far
like
as I
that.
know, they only have the present, and to say that they're gonna do something tomorrow, they fall back on those words. Tomorrow, next week, but the tense
The
is not
tense
there.
itself isn't there.
Yeah, so how are we gonna teach those concepts like this? Because it's a huge concept to grasp. Like, okay, so instead of saying tomorrow, you say tomorrow, I will. Like instead, it's two things I need to worry about now. Or like they don't have words for colors. They say this is the color of grass. Like they don't. So how do you teach this? Maybe those might be a little easier, but
I think just knowing